So thank you, Jackie, and thank you all for having us, and congratulations again, Pedro, on an extraordinary presentation. Huge mind-expanding ideas about what we're all about, right? Not just about functional things and practical steps and policy changes, but about our mission as leaders or as practitioners in education. I'm going to take one step back. Jackie knows we have a whole script, and I'm about to blow it up. So.
As he always does.
As I always. Well, you can't listen to Pedro and go with what you were thinking before. So let me just try to locate this work, the National Commission's work, this group of almost, 75 leaders, philanthropists, educators, parents, young people, scholars, policy leaders who have all come together to form this National Commission. So it's not just 8 or 10 wonks from Washington. We have grassroots teachers, social workers, we have parents, all these kinds. So this moment of consensus, which we are trying to build at the National Commission, didn't just start 18 months ago when the Commission got launched. It really has its roots back in the 60s and 70s. Some would even say in John Dewey 100 years ago. But let me give you the shorter version of it, at least my own version. I'm teaching in the New Haven Public Schools, struggling, frankly, failing a good deal, maybe like your nephew, feeling an enormous amount of frustration, trying to reach kids who are at risk in the old language. I end up getting a fellowship to work with James Comer at the Yale Child Study Center, a pioneering medical doctor, child psychiatrist, who had left the clinic, left the couch to go out into the community because he recognized that individual treatment wasn't the solution to the issues facing children. So I walk into Jim Comer's office in September, my fellowship year at the Child Study Center, to study child development and the practices he'd pioneered in New Haven schools. And he taught me 2 lessons the first day. The first lesson he taught me was this. He says, he writes up on the whiteboard in his office. It was an old easel, you know, the old-fashioned easels you have in your office if you're a professor in those days. He writes a squiggly line and an A, and he says, look at these 2 shapes. One's the alphabetical letter A, and the other is a squiggly line. He says, if you're 5 years old, which one is more interesting and why? The answer to the first question is neither is intuitively more interesting than the other. And he says, now, why would the child be more interested in the A than in the squiggly line? One reason. A significant adult wants the child to know the meaning of the A. So a bonded relationship between the adult and the child is the pathway for the child acquiring an interest in the shape A and therefore in understanding its meaning for the life of the child. Now, he says this to me, and I've been in schools already at this point 5 years, and I'm like, whoa. I never thought of it that way. The insight was, in my view, quite powerful and links to the insight Pedro made earlier. The social and emotional factors are learning. They don't support learning. They're not corollary or appendices to learning. They are learning. Learning is relational. The pathway through which, even if we're connecting right now at all, if what I'm saying is resonating with you at all, it is because even though we don't necessarily know each other, we have enough history, enough common boundaries that you're listening to me and finding some meaning in what I'm saying, or not, in which case you're disengaged in answering emails, which is also possible because I have failed to acquire, earn, warrant your attention. The insight here changed my career completely, for whatever it's worth, and I went back into high school education with Jim Comer's framework, which was that there are academic dimensions to learning, social dimensions, and emotional dimensions, and that the school needed to pay attention to all of them. And my insight was a lot of people are paying attention to academics. Almost nobody is showing teachers how to do the social and emotional side. So I started scouting around. I said to Jim, well, okay, we're in a high school. We suspend 4 or 5 kids a day. What am I supposed to do? And he says, well, you should talk to them and, you know, listen to them. And I'm like, I tried that. They still got 3 days or 5 days or 10 days or expulsions. So we went around scouting with Jim and others to try to find the strategies, the concrete, practical strategies that teachers, administrators, principals, and supervisors could use and implement that would address the social and emotional needs of children. From those conversations in New Haven and other places around the country came the field of social and emotional learning, not as a replacement of academics, but as the partner to the academic enterprise that would help equip teachers with the practical skills to do the work of engaging the heart and the relational context in addition to the academic context. Okay, hopefully that makes some sense in setting the context for today. The second thing Jim taught me in that first day was that every problem in kids at risk will eventually be a problem in majority kids. And that kids at risk are canaries in the coal mine for the culture. And to Pedro's point, equity, it's almost as though I felt like you redefined equity as justice. Because we're no longer about equalizing for white kids who have anxiety or eating disorders or depression or suicide with, let's say, minority-oriented kids who have poverty and stress and community risks and so on and so forth. We're about providing justice for all those kids, a just and high-quality education. Now, the reason I say that is simply this. We no longer have the luxury of dichotomizing the social and emotional factors in learning and the academic. It's a lie. It has never been development. It has never been human experience. It has never been education. So when people say to you, well, we don't have time, or we don't have the resources to do that, or please tell them that that is a false dichotomy. There is no learning that is not social and emotional, and there is no learning that is not academic too. There isn't any. The only question is whether we do it with quality. Do we ignore the realities of child development that Jim taught me about in that one lesson, or do we integrate them and pay attention to them? Do we engage the social and emotional life of children in a high-quality way, or do we fail kids and try to ignore it and reduce the quality of learning? All kids. Stressed out high wealth kids, stressed out low-income kids. Same issues. So fast forward. I know Jackie's looking at me like, where the hell is he going? Okay, let's get to the commission. The commission is, as I said earlier, 80 people, depending on how you count, from all over the country, all walks of life. We have 3 insights after a year of work. The first is that the work in the integration of social and emotional and academic factors is happening in the communities already, all over the country. The demand is huge. We've changed our language from preparing a report to the nation to trying to develop a report from the nation. This is a report from your schools and states where they are asking colleges of education, policymakers, state boards of education, please pay attention to the needs of our kids. It's a report from the bottom up. Secondly, it's a report, it's a process that's building a consensus. You cannot make policy if the people interested in grit are fighting against the people interested in empathy, who are fighting against the people interested in character, who are fighting against the people interested in deeper learning, who are fighting against the people interested in mindsets, who are fighting against the people interested in social-emotional learning. That is chaos. And you will be bombarded by all those people saying, I've got a policy for you, teach grit. I've got a policy for you, teach empathy. And to the extent that you don't look beyond all of those, all of us in the field, to create structures and policies that advance development and plug those pieces into a coherent whole, you will be victims of our own dysfunction. So the second thing the Commission's trying to do is create an orderly, aligned field from the scholars and leaders in the field, because we're part of the problem. Third thing we're trying to do is focus on, as Pedro said, teaching and learning. Not on who gets paid, not on who gets punished, but on how to support teachers and administrators in helping their children develop in classrooms. So those 3 fundamental shifts in the structure of this commission, I think, position it to make a significant contribution to your challenge of creating good policy and good structures and good supports in the way that Pedro articulated it. So we're hoping to be of service to you. What is, Jackie always says, well, tell people what is social and emotional learning. Pause. You all know there's 100 frameworks. Almost any of them are close enough to write. I'll give you the Castle framework. The CASEL framework has 5 developmental competencies: self-awareness and self-management, which have to do with understanding yourself and being able to manage yourself. 2 competency areas that are focused on relationships, relationship skills and social awareness, being able to take perspective of the other and being able to manage your relationships with the others. The 5th dimension is problem-solving skills, effective, ethical problem solving. Now, you take that framework, we have a nice wheel, we can give it to you if you want to use it. You can show it to your chief state school officers, to your governors, to your legislatures. This is now, there's another framework, comes from the Chicago Consortium. There's 2 or 3 others out there. It doesn't matter that much which one you choose. They're developmentally sound, evidence-based frameworks that say, here are the social and emotional dimensions of learning. Develop a scope and sequence. You have curriculum up there. I would go further. Develop a scope and sequence, pre-K to 12, that shows how you're going to address these issues. I don't know a single state well, I shouldn't say that. There are districts. I don't know a single state that has a scope and sequence, although there are states that have standards in this area. Illinois is one. A few others have them too. So when will it become normal for a state or a district or a school to have a scope and sequence that addresses the social and emotional development of children the same way we develop the linguistic or quantitative skills that children develop over time? We start with numeral theory in kindergarten. We end up with calculus in 12th grade. There's a sequence. The same kind of sequence exists for the development of self-regulation, relationship skills, ethical decision-making, and so on. We ought to teach it. We ought to equip teachers to do it. It is fundamentally the educational enterprise. Always has been. Not new. Just ignored in the last, I would say, 100 years. Even though Dewey said we should do it in 1914. And everybody that goes to school in education reads Dewey, and you ask people what do they do with Dewey, almost everybody says nothing. Everybody's a Dewey fan. Nobody has done anything with Dewey. Everybody's a Montessori fan. People have done things with Montessori. Why? Because she developed practical tools to enable people to use them in classrooms and in schools. That's what we're trying to do with the commission, to take the field, evidence-based, only evidence-based. Not opinion, not I like this, not it felt good, not it was a heart-wrenching assembly, not everybody stand and cheered, not my children smiled when I walked through the door. Evidence-based practices, mostly developed through randomized controlled trials that document the impact of these interventions on improving things like test scores, yes, test scores, academic scores, attendance, dropout rates, and violence. All administrative data you've already got. That's what the commission's trying to do. I'll stop there.
And so Jean, you're really really the expert on the panel in terms of the state role, and especially with your expertise with CCSSO and as well as with NASBE. Do you want to shift the conversation to talking a little bit about what you think that state role is in this era of ESSA?
Sure, but I'm ready to leave after these 2.
Okay.
You're in a position that no other group has been in historically. You're the first generation of policymakers that have been expected to do 2 things that we assumed were not possible in this country. One, you're going to teach to children certain things that we've not asked children to learn in the past, and those are based on the realities of those children, where they are now, where they're going to go. And part of that is, yeah, we have held on to and refined the knowledge that we expect students to know, but we've added this whole set of skills, how one uses knowledge, as Pedro indicated in the slides. And then finally, a number of you are beginning to address this whole issue of social emotional learning. You call it different things in the state depending on your language, but you're beginning to embrace this idea of dispositions. What is the importance? So that's enough of a challenge in itself. But the second part of this was Pedro's first slide, this equity slide, which is that now we're expected and we're embracing this idea that we're going to do this with all children. So, congratulations. This is a new world. And for state policymakers, it ought to be in your heads confusing, and it ought to be exciting, and it ought to be challenging. But what you do with that dual challenge is going to determine the future of education in the country. Add to that this shift that has just occurred in the country. Now, it's not something that's a byproduct of the current administration. This is something that's been coming for a number of years, and that is this balance of power about who makes decisions about children and the future of children. We've always, at least constitutionally, indicated that this is a state responsibility and local responsibility. But as we know, the federal government has exerted itself dramatically in education over recent years for good intent and purposes. Many because we weren't doing what we were supposed to do as states to address the needs of children. But that balance has been shifted, and it is, again, congratulations. This is in your lap. This could be an opportunity, or it could be a real threat to education in the country. And there are many people out there betting on the fact that you're not going to take this up and run with it. In fact, I hear that conversation often. The biggest fear I have is that states are not going to assume the rightful responsibility that they have for our children. There is another side of this that I happen to be on, and that I see this as an opportunity to lead. This is a time that you need to step up and take responsibility for the lives of children in your state. Ultimately, the state is the responsible agent in education in this country. The courts have reaffirmed that over and over again. If a local district is not performing, it's your responsibility to take care of those kids. If they are performing, you need to provide support to them. So there's a second issue here that's different is this shift. New responsibilities, a shift in authority. I think the third one is we need to be paying attention to the field right now for policymakers. There's a great deal of frustration out there, and it's showing itself in multiple ways. A recruitment of teachers was an issue that Pedro mentioned earlier, but morale is at an all-time low among the teaching profession. So there's a high level of frustration. But on the other hand, I think teachers are resilient as they can be. When we issued many of the recent challenges to the teaching force in this country, they said two things to us. Thank goodness we're getting serious about this work. We want to work with our kids. The second message to us was, but we don't know how to do this. We need help and we need time. And you as state board members sit in a seat where you can give them more help than they've received in the past and different help than they've received in the past. And you can give them some time to learn, to grow, and to develop knowledge. Finally, I think I would say the big implication for state boards is that we are beginning to shift away from this sort of incremental patching up, adding on to this idea of transformation. It's happening in certain sites, and there's some good models out there, but you need to embrace this idea that the system you inherited was built for different purposes in a different time, and that now you've got to begin to think about how you transform this system so that it serves children in this time, in this circumstance, and with the kids that are going to lead this country into the future. That includes clear standards, and we have emphasized, and I've been a part of that academic standards movement in this country, but in my worst nightmare, I didn't envision that people would assume that that was the totality of learning that a student needs to know.
Well, I think there's several things, and as we've kind of taken this in a different pathway as a panel, I think in some ways we're going back to the one-room schoolhouse, and I reflect on my career early on where social emotional development were critically a part of the role and responsibility of teachers, and they knew that, they accepted it, and that's part of the art that moved them into the profession in the first place. And I think when we look at what's happened from a policy level from 2000 on till where we are today with No Child Left Behind, you would think the concept of No Child Left Behind would have been about children, but it wasn't. It became really a narrowing and a very narrow policy compliance process. And I think that really was a detriment to many of our schools of innovation and creativity because of that balance. And so I think the shifting in the policy environment of where we are today creates a renewed opportunity to build and forge relationships between state and local school districts. And that is the heart of our work as policymakers. And to let go of that federal mandate mentality that moved us into a very, very narrow direction that I think disengaged educators in the process. You did an excellent job in talking about disengaging students. We have disengaged educators, and we've disengaged parents in this process. So I think our policies need to start to think in that direction. In Nebraska, there's really 3 initiatives that I'm going to touch base on that have converged over the past 3 years that really are changing the conversation in Nebraska, and I believe are our catalyst to thinking about student success in a broader context for children that live in Nebraska. One of those was a mandate for a new accountability system that our legislature said to the State Board of Education, you will develop a new accountability system. And in that legislation, they didn't define a lot of detail, which was very unusual for us. And they said, you have the responsibility to determine what that accountability system should look like. But at the end of the day, they had just a few elements in that classification for accountability that they wanted to look at. And that led our board with a new commissioner to really have deep conversations about what should accountability look like in Nebraska. And that accountability system then moved into an area that we focus on 2 domains, and I won't go into detail. We call our accountability system a quality education system for today and tomorrow, AQuest, because it is that interplay between accountability and quality that becomes an important foundation for us in our accountability system. And 2 domains we focus on are teaching and learning and student success and access. And I think those 2 domains start to build a foundation for us to think differently about how we hold schools accountable. But that accountability is a partnership. It's not carrying the stick. It's really building that partnership. The next phase was the adoption of a strategic plan. We did not have a strategic plan as the State Board of Education and the Department of Education. And in our analysis, we discovered the Department of Education had a different mission and purpose than the State Board of Education. Well, that's a little problematic. And so we went through a process, and my colleague, Molly O'Halloran, is here, a long process to engage stakeholders in our accountability system, but stakeholders in our adoption of a new strategic plan, and convened a host of people in both of those processes to say, what do you believe is important? So that was another critical element. And in that strategic plan, it certainly has indicators that you would look for, but it also starts to change to create a focus on what are the systems of support. So our discussion at a state level is not about what our schools aren't doing, but our discussion begins much more around what are the systems of support that our schools need to be successful with students. There's some other elements that are coming into play. We have student engagement and satisfaction is one of our strategic goals and initiative. Many of our districts in Nebraska use the Gallup student poll. And if you're not familiar with that poll, it's a resource for students 5th through 12th grade. And it focuses on engagement, hope, entrepreneurial aspiration, and career and financial literacy. And what's fascinating, it's optional for our schools right now. It's not something we're mandating. But what we have is many of our schools participating in that survey and learning some really interesting information that we as policymakers at the local level and state level need to think about. And that's the trajectory of disengagement from 5th grade to 12th grade, exactly as you were pointing out earlier. We need to understand that. What is causing this disengagement from a level of 70 to 85% in 5th grade to 25% in 12th grade. That's a concern for us as policymakers to understand what's happening with disengagement. We also are focusing more on interventions and what are some of the things that we can do for interventions, as well as then looking at measures that go beyond an assessment measure, but looking at multiple measures that start to tell the story. Measures of mobility. How do you help school districts with high mobility? How do you help students who are highly mobile? What are the kinds of systems of support we need to think about for those students who are highly mobile to be successful? How do we continue to think about dropout rates, chronic absenteeism, not just attendance, but chronic absenteeism? That's telling us another story that I believe is certainly a foundation and tied to the social and emotional needs of our students. ESSA then came after the fact. So we've tried to weave what we've been doing into our ESSA plan. Do we have it right? No. Do we have a lot of work to do? Yes. But I believe we've moved the conversation in the right direction in Nebraska. And now how do we determine a stronger policy framework to support what we're starting to do in accountability and in our strategic direction?
So I just want to touch on one of the points that you made, and that is this notion of disengagement that's occurred across the board because of the federal mandate. And I want Tim to comment on one of the most important things about the commission is, even though we are called a national commission, the focus on state and local context.
Yeah, well, I think it's been said. I think the issue for you guys, as Jean's pointing out, you have this paradigm-shifting moment, and the question is, how do you add value to states? To districts. If you ask me, people say the principal's the most important person in education. Other people say the teacher's the most important person. Superintendent's the most important. Chief state school officer's most. President's most important. Okay, everybody's important, right? But your role, in my view, is to add value to superintendents. If you ask me, I haven't been a chief, I know, so Jean's about to disagree with me, that's good, so we can mix it up a little bit. But if you provide the technical assistance necessary to support districts in shifting to a whole child framework, I think you will have navigated the new territory that Jean identified earlier and that Rachel's just described trying to navigate. So in our view, the commission is trying to help practitioners with the best available science, with the best available science of implementation and change, which is an underrepresented science in our field in education, if you ask me. So science of effectiveness, science of implementation, and science of change, right? If you put those together, that's, in my view, your job. If the superintendent comes to you and says, okay, ESSA tells us to do 3 or 4 new things differently, how do we do them? You're going to have to help them know what to do, how to do it, and how to manage the change process. The commission, in its consensus statement on research, has already issued a very bold blueprint that says there's no more either or. The evidence is clear. These skills are malleable. They're important. They have an impact on health, on psychological health, on employability, on academic achievement, on all those measures over a long period of time. So the commission has already said, we know that you have to do this. All the science agrees on that. The commission's now working on what should be, in my view, what I would call the science of implementation. How? Right? And then your job, I think, will be in part to figure out how to support the change management process, which is another extraordinarily complex thing. Businesses spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff. Schools spend almost no time. So anyway, I don't want to get on my soapbox, but I have 3 education degrees. Ask me how many classes I took on child development. 1. Sophomore in college. 1. On child development. It's shocking. How many courses did I take on change management? 0. What do principals do? What do superintendents do? What do chief states? What is your job? Your job is to manage change. How many people are trained in it in this room? Okay, good. There's a hand. Get her card. But it's a complex field, right? And if you're running GE or you're running IBM or Google or Facebook, trust me, the room is full of change management experts. It's not just a bunch of coders. They think about this stuff. We don't. Anyway, so I'm off subject. I'll stop there. The commission is trying to give you the tools that will enable you to act as a evidence-based asset to your districts and schools and give you the frameworks and practices that will guide you, not just direct you, but guide you in making choices that will actually be practically useful all the way down to the kindergarten teacher or the 6th grade teacher or the high school calculus teacher who's trying to make calculus come alive in a way that's resonant and has purpose and desire built into it. So the kid says, I want to learn calculus. Because if the kid doesn't want to learn calculus, the kid's not going to learn calculus.
So one of the most important things to know about Tim, when he says he's done, he's almost always not. And it's usually
that's so mean.
It's usually I know. It's usually when a little bit of profanity comes out that I know we're on the home stretch. Okay. All right. Just a little bit, by the way. All right. So last night we were at dinner, and I asked the question last night at dinner. And this may come from the business background that I have, but I want to know, Pedro, I'm going to ask you the question because I asked it last night of a couple of other members at the dinner table, and I want to know in the context of ESSA and in the context of, or with an equity lens, like what should we be thinking about measuring? Like in general terms, like what are the competencies? What are the elements? What are the things that we should be looking at in terms of a measurement to get at what we described as quality student learning?
So let me start by saying that we have to rethink the whole accountability framework, okay? Because what we've had is a top-down accountability, where those with the most power have the least accountability. Right? And we push it all down on the people with the least power. I asked a superintendent of a very large district a while ago, I said, what are you accountable for? And he looked, and it was in front of a lot of people, said, I'm accountable for holding everybody else accountable. So that's a problem. And I think we need to spell out what people in leadership roles are accountable for. They have to provide the means through which others get their job done, right? If they don't, they're setting them up for failure, right? So that then takes me to the question that you asked, which is how do you measure it? We have to measure, our measures have to include things like access, right? Do kids have access to a qualified teacher? If we want them to perform, we need to make sure it's not the kids' fault if they were taught by an incompetent teacher. Right? That's the district or the state's fault, that they allowed an incompetent teacher to be sent to that school. So we need to so access to the courses, to the opportunities to learn should be part of what we're also taking account for and what we're also measuring, in addition to student outcomes. And then when we start talking about student outcomes, in addition to the academic outcomes, we should think about things like whether or not kids have had access to it, done an internship, perhaps, or the kinds of opportunities that we know lead to jobs, lead to careers. So I would think very broadly about those. But the main thing is that we have to move away from, and I want to build on Rachel's point, we have to not just set up more standards for which only schools are accountable. We have to then say the state's accountable. When the state or the federal government says, look, we're going to open up an airport in the middle of nowhere, we're going to put a TSA person in there anyway, right? Because that's one of our standards. It has to be safe. The state does that, or the federal government does that. We don't think about schools that way. We literally will put kids in schools that are not safe, and then blame the schools for the lack of safety, and schools that we know are unfit for learning. So we need to rethink this, and then put the accountability back on those with the most power and who control the purse.
Okay, so in the context, you used the language earlier, moving away from the culture of compliance. So Rachel and Jean, so if we think about some of the essay in the context of what Rachel described as this greater latitude that you saw in terms of an accountability system. If you were guiding all of the participants here in the room and thinking about that latitude, what advice would you give to them to say, okay, take advantage of this flexibility, and these are the things that you should be focusing on? You want to go first, Gene?
Yeah, first of all, the latitude you have is tremendous. In fact, I've been a bit disappointed in some of the state submissions at this point in that they seem too incremental to me. You have authority right now to make some major shifts in your accountability structure, the whole design of the educational enterprise in your state. There's very, very limited control over this right now. First, if I were in your seat, I would open this conversation with the community about what we want our students to know and be able to do and be. And I'm not sure that, this is a personal view, I'm not sure that I would mandate that from the state level. This is something that every community ought to own and have a responsibility for developing. I think you have a responsibility to improve your information gathering systems at the state level so that you have more and varied information coming into you on a regular basis, that becomes an integral part of your decision-making process at the state board. What do we know now from experiences that have occurred at this point, and what are we going to do about those ought to be sort of the mindset, which leads to this sort of continuous improvement mindset. One thing that I've encouraged the chiefs to do in their ESSA plans, I don't know how many of them have done it, we're still looking at it now, is that you build in this idea of continuous improvement. One of the things we got into on No Child Left Behind was that we froze ourselves for the 15 years here in terms of a model of implementation. If you can build in this idea that we're going to continue to learn and we're going to change our compact with the federal government based on what we learn, that's the central component of decision making at that board table. And then I think if I were you, I would, and this has always been a strength of state boards, and that is you are the bloody pulpit for the state. I would shore up and increase those activities that you have with local communities so that you have a combined voice coming from the state board as well as the local communities. I can tell you this, you have strong voices, you have influence, but I can also tell you that when local folks are making those same points, you're going to have a lot more shift in the state legislature than you're going to have your voice alone. So building that coalition between the State Board of Education and those local boards of education and those local communities is absolutely essential as we move forward. You've got to influence the governors and the state boards of education. They're the ones that set the purse strings, and that is a major issue of inequity in this system, and it's not going to change unless there's a strong consensus of the public that that's going to need changing. If I were in your seats, I would also be beginning to think about taking care of yourselves, learning yourselves about this issue. We've made a strong case here for the inclusion of academic and social and emotional. We've made that same point to the teachers, but we haven't helped those teachers develop the skill set to deliver against that promise. So what is the state role in all of this? You don't train those teachers directly, but you do set the conditions for those preparation programs that they go through. I would make sure that this is infused into that pre-service training program. You do have control over the way in which professional development is managed in your state, and we can get, I don't want to get into, again, a long dissertation on this thing, but I will make this statement. The current system of identifying and rewarding teachers is inconsistent with the goals that we have for professional learning in this country. And despite that, the teachers are trying to get out of it. So how do you begin to develop very, very different systems? And I think the problem is not the teachers, it's the system around those teachers. We have a system that is not geared toward collaborative learning, a system that does not reward teachers for a progress against their goals in a combined and learning environment. We need to build off of those professional learning communities as a site. Local schools need to have control of those budgets There are just a whole bunch of issues here that the state board can begin to challenge and to change in order to transcend the system. That's a few things.
That's a few things. That's a few things, right?
It's hard to add on some of this conversation. I think one of my key takeaways from Nebraska and what I would encourage is not to put your emphasis on ESSA. It isn't really about ESSA. It is about what you're doing around your systems for accountability, your systems for support, your strategic direction. That's what's important today, finally. And, you know, I look back, I'm an old voc ed person, also career and tech ed person, and we never talked about Perkins. You talked about career and technical education. Right. When you say Perkins to people, they typically don't know what you're talking about. That's the federal framework. It's a support system. Career and tech ed in your state is what's important. We need to talk about what's important in our states and how we're going to get there. And that's student success through school success. And what are the conditions we're putting in place to help students and schools be successful? And that means relooking at, if you've changed policies because of No Child Left Behind, then you've got some work to do to change direction to make sure your policies are really supporting that success for every student, for all students. You need to think about your regulatory authority. We're going through a process of how do we build accountability and accreditation together in a different way, as opposed to the old models of accreditation. Some of that conversation has been put on back burners for 15 years. It needs to come forward. So I think it's really each state understanding the needs of their state and taking on the responsibility of the education of the children in their state in the way that best meets the needs of local communities and local school districts.
Okay, great.
Can I just make one quick comment and come back to the point you made earlier, Rachel? Because I think there are big solutions, framework, spanning, paradigm shifting solutions, and then you sort of, Jean mentioned, you know, incremental versus big. I just want to suggest one strategy that's under our nose that's incremental in some ways, but opens the door to the big, and it's what Rachel said earlier: school climate surveys. It may seem like a small thing, but there are ways to do school culture and climate measures now that are nationally normed and validated, that are accepted by the U.S. Department of Education, a range of them, that ask questions around safety and purpose and relationship, that don't disaggregate the data by individual kids, so they don't blame kids, protects against blaming and compartmentalizing kids who are at greater risk versus kids who are less. So you can use these instruments today, part of ESSA plans, but not necessarily. I agree with you. I think it's a great point. And it will help to begin the conversation using nationally normed evidence-based instruments, which are valid and reliable, but at the same time allow for lots of local choice and discretion in how they're used. Now, it's not going to boil the ocean. It's not going to allow us to, you know, rethink the whole enterprise, and, you know, but it will begin, I believe, these instruments allow us to begin different conversations, but not leave it up to people to kind of figure it out for themselves. Because I worry all the time, again, maybe it's my school-based experience or my district, you know, when people would say to me, well, think differently about this, think differently about that, try some new, I'd be like walking out like, what the hell do I do?
Right.
So here's just one strategy that maybe some of your states have implemented or put into your ESSA plan. Some of them have. I haven't read all the plans like Jean has. But I would just highlight, you're using the Gallup instrument because it's a Nebraska company, of course.
What can
No
we say?
problem. That's local control.
What can we say?
That's local control at its best. But it's a good instrument.
It is a good instrument. It's very, very good
Gallup has good tools.
It's a good instrument. But you probably have companies in your states that have good instruments. Anyway, my point is just don't skip over too quickly school culture and climate as a powerful new tool in this discussion, both about how we evaluate our schools as well as how we promote change discussions.
And what we measure.
Yeah.
right, so before we go to
That
Q,
just-
okay, go
That
ahead.
reminds me, just
Rhea Pedro,
getting
the last
started
word, by the
very
way.
quickly. A tool that some of you have started to use and getting started on this is this idea of innovation zones or some sort of opportunity for you as boards to find those places that are ready to take on social emotional learning, begin to rethink how they're doing business, have shown a bit of a history, have good leadership in place. Some boards have created opportunities outside the regular system, the skunk works kind of thing, that allows those districts to be the leads on this work. So it also helps you begin to define your role in this kind of a circumstance. So one, if you were to go back, create legislatively this opportunity for these innovation zones to occur, it frees them from the traditional regulations that you have in place. And it also gives you a laboratory to begin to learn what might be implied future policy actions at your state level. It also helps you begin to emphasize that innovation, the real innovation in the future, is going to be at the local level, not at the state level. So that learning laboratory, create that learning laboratory, use the lessons out of those learning laboratories so that you can begin to apply them to general policy that you set. You then have to support that. It's not enough to just say, you guys go out there and do what you want to do because you're innovative and we've created a sphere. What is the role of the state in supporting those? It means finding the capacity, may not be in the state education agency, but find the capacity to help those districts as they move forward, beginning to develop a research base at the state level that can be fed into that system and advise them, linking them in networks with each other and with broader networks across the country. Those are the kinds of roles that state boards can begin to play.
All right, well, we started with Pedro. You had the first word, and we're going to end. Do you want to close out, and then we'll open it up to question and answer? And just what final words of advice would you have to the group here today?
So I want to just follow up on Gene's last point, right? That is that you have to create the space to allow for innovation, right? That the way the systems have been designed breed compliance, and so New York City, under Mike Bloomberg, created that kind of environment. They created empowerment schools, and several of the new small schools that were created during that period became very high performing. Now, the mistake they made was they allowed too many schools to become autonomous that weren't ready for it, right? And that led to a lot of those schools just floundering. But I think that Gene's point that you know innovation requires space. It also requires that when we see progress, we learn from it, right? And that needs to be, that's a role the state can play too. And say, look at what we're doing over here. Come and visit, because we have so many schools that are just working in isolation. This is particularly true in rural areas, but over and over again, I have to tell people there are places that are serving the same kinds of kids you have that are doing a much better job. And I say, you know, the state should do this. The state should be able to shine the light and say, here's where it works, this is what's going on, and then really understand why is it working, right? Why is it that they're getting better results here than we're getting in most places? Because we've got, you know, it's ironic that in education we don't learn that much, right, from success. We do it in other fields, but we don't do it in education.
So let's open it up to questions. And you're welcome to walk up to the mic, or we can hear you from your table. That's fine as well.
Hi. One of the barriers that I see to success with schools that try to do this work is sort of with initiative overload. Like they're doing PBS, they're doing SEL, they're doing trauma-informed practices, they're doing restorative justice. And I feel like that it overwhelms teachers, and that sometimes is the reason why they don't succeed at doing this work. So I was wondering if you have any reflections on that.
So I do. Well, no. I think it is the problem in school reform, and it's why, if you even use the word school reform, it's why most teachers are resistant to change. It's not just because they're resistant to change dispositionally. It's because it's done poorly. It's done in a chaotic way. It's done episodically. It's done without sustainable supports. It's done without integration. So the idea of addressing the social and emotional dimensions of learning requires a coherent, sustainable plan. You cannot do 7 initiatives. and you can't do 7 initiatives well. You can do a change management process well that shows how classroom instruction, discipline strategies, and community engagement strategies work harmoniously together and are one sustainable plan. But if you start first year doing, your empathy program, as I said earlier, and your second year we're going to introduce the GRIT program, and then we're going to do PBIS, and then we're going to do restorative practices, and then we're going to do Tier 1, Tier 2 practices, and then we're going to do family, and the teachers are going to go, what are you, crazy? Stop. We want one strategy. Now, one strategy may include dimensions of PBIS or not, depending on where you fall on that issue. It may include a K-12 curriculum that's done by Lions Quest, which is a K-12 scope and sequence, all in. Or you may say, look, we want to do empathy in our early childhood program. We want to focus more on grit in the middle years. We want to focus more on purpose and character in the high school years. But you put it together as one plan. So the issue for me is, how do we get out of project and check the box frameworks into systematic? And by systematic, I think there's 3 domains in schools that all have to work together: classroom, school culture, and community. You can call it different ways. It's 3 C's. It's easy for me to remember. A strategy that links those things in a multi-year change-oriented strategy plan, right? So this is where the plan matters most. And the plan can be revised. You can update it at the end of the year. I've seen great schools in Chicago and other places. They started in one direction. The teachers said, this isn't working. They replaced the curriculum, brought in a new one. But the teachers all joined in the process. They didn't go, I'm overwhelmed, you changed the curriculum. They were part of the strategic planning process that allowed them to tinker with the solutions they were using and adapt them to the needs and the responses they were getting from their kids. So I think it's an integrated plan that's necessary to make this work. Again, this is Jim Comer taught me this almost 40 years ago. I hate to say it. It's not new, but planning is a missing art in the way in which we manage change, and is necessary for this. Otherwise, we will alienate teachers, and rightfully so.
Go ahead,
Just
Pedro.
briefly on this, because I agree completely. I think a lot of times I see districts trying to implement restorative practices. They don't understand restorative practices only work if you change the school culture.
Right.
Right. And so this idea that it's integrated is really critical. But the Gates Foundation, as many of you have heard, announced a new initiative. All right, they're going to do these school improvement networks, which I actually think have promise. But what he didn't do when he announced it was reflect on their lessons. They've spent several $1 billion on school reform. To keep announcing initiatives and not say we've learned some things, both about what doesn't work and what might work, to me is an arrogance that creates cynicism, right? I think Bill Gates, when he spoke at the Council of Great City Schools, should have said, first of all, we've wasted a lot of money, right? And these are the things we've learned from the investments we've made about what works, what doesn't work, and this is why we're going to invest in this. Because that's what we don't do. We try things, and then we just move to something else. And no one even asks, did it work? Did it not work? And that breeds deep cynicism amongst educators who they're tired of being reformed over and over again. And I think we should all be skeptical of someone announcing the latest new gimmick, do this, and it too will make your hair grow and your kids learn, and it leads to, my colleague Charles Payne wrote a book, So Much Reform, Why So Little Change? And it gets at this issue that Tim spoke to. We're not changing the culture of learning, and consequently, we're breeding a sense, and this is really disturbing, in the public that we can't do this. And when that happens, the whole enterprise is in trouble.
Just one quick, parenthetical addition. Castle, we thought about this about 10 years ago. We launched this thing called the Collaborating Districts Initiative. So Atlanta's in it. Nashville, I think some people from Nashville are in it. Cleveland's in it. Anchorage is in it. Oakland's in it. Lots of districts around the country. Austin and so on. The fundamental premise of this school improvement network strategy was that we were in for multiple years of comprehensive change management. And what we brought was just some technical assistance, but what we created was a continuous commitment to a set of principles. Now, in some of these districts, like Oakland has had 3 superintendents since we started. Almost uninterrupted progress, which is shocking. like even I talked to Antoine, who was the middle superintendent, Antoine Wilson, who's now in DC, who left. He's the middle of the 3 superintendents. He's also shocked at how deeply ingrained the ownership of the change has become in the district, because they're in it together. They have a plan, they have a strategy. So the changes at the top, the quick disruption, I'm not defending the disruptions, but when they happen, if you've got a strategy that the teachers own and believe in, and they see it as a coherent integration, they will stay with it, even when the politics results or circumstance results in volatility at the top.
A couple of thoughts from state board level. One is that we don't have a profession. We call them a profession, but teachers are consumers of other people's idea generally. So how do you, as a board, begin to think of teachers as producers of knowledge? And that implies every teacher as a researcher, applied researcher, teachers coming together into teams to help them solve those problems. That becomes the locus. If a program fits within that context, then it makes sense. Nothing comes into that school without that sort of thoughtful production process by teachers and administrators. Secondly is, I think board members need to move away from standardization of practice to context. Every learning community is very different. We ought to not only tolerate that, we ought to honor it and respect it and allow folks to come forward with things that look very different, but getting to the same goals and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve.
Well, someone else should come up for the second question, but what I will tell you that in every one of these forums that we go to and we speak, that question that you asked is always one of the first questions, because you can just sense that there were a number of educators in this room, this sense of being overwhelmed, like, okay, where do I begin? And that's one of the most important lessons learned that the Commission is really taking a look at to make sure that we provide that roadmap, that framework in a really comprehensive way. So the next question.
I'm Dr. Z from Detroit, Michigan. I was deeply impressed, Tim, with your description of the emotional link that makes people care enough to want to learn. It took me back to my childhood, where my sister was very eager to please the teachers, and so she got good reports to our mom. And as far as I thought about it, I wanted to annoy the teachers. So I was not motivated by that. I was fortunate to find the inner logic in many subjects, most notably reading. And sometimes the good news that education is enjoyable and rewarding is sometimes lost. And furthermore, there's a kind of structure to learning. First you go through the tedium, and then it becomes self-rewarding. Mm-hmm. We experienced that with Monopoly. The first 2 games of Monopoly were really torturous, but we had friends that urged us and that it was worthwhile, and I guess that's the social-emotional component. And thereafter, we played it because we enjoyed it, not because of these supports. So any comments on the experience of us that for whom learning apart from these social emotional contexts, and of course cyber learning is one of those where you learn a lot without a real connection with other people, and that structure of learning, how we bridge the gap from the tedium into the self-rewarding aspects of it.
Yeah, so that's a big question. The way I'd answer it is, at its simplest level, is that saying that learning has an emotional underpinnings or relational dimensions doesn't mean that there's only one way in which those relationships play out. So internalized motivation, some would argue, is the internalization of relationship. So you found, let's say, in reading To Kill a Mockingbird, or reading a Langston Hughes poem, or reading a Shakespearean play, all of a sudden some sense of yourself, some sense of purpose, joy, delight, anger, frustration, whatever it was, those emotions connecting you to that poem or that piece of literature are the internalization of a set of relationships that you've conceptualized in your mind. Without going too technical or too boring, I think the point we make in the field of social emotional learning is that those dimensions are there. So when you emphasize grit and perseverance in the face of failure versus reward and recognition in the face of success is the art of teaching. Because it's social and emotional doesn't mean you walk in every day saying, you know, I love you, you're perfect, you did great. Right? You may have failed the test. I mean, it's not wrong to fail a test. How many people haven't failed a test? Everybody's failed. I mean, speaking from maybe Pedro and Dean, Rachel haven't failed tests, but I've failed tests. And you learn from, that's what sports is. Sports is one of these success-failure experiences that mixes it all up together and keeps you connected. So there's not one way in which relationships work. It's just that they're always operating. Even in solitary experiences. The monastics, the mystics will tell you this. These are the most solitary of all people. And yet they will describe to you their experiences in solitude, even hermits, as relationships in community. So the community is not there with a lot of people running around holding their hands, but the community is a nested experience that allows the solitude to be possible. So there's not one way to answer the question about how relationships work. There's just a premise that they are always operating even when they're not visible. And beyond that, we'd have to go into like how you teach coping skills. So we have a lot of experience now teaching children coping strategies. You saw some of it with the mindfulness experience in the video. That mindfulness can translate into a coping capacity if it's taught well. So you can teach kids lots of coping strategies that include perseverance and grit, but also include stress management and relaxation. Sometimes you need one, sometimes you need the other. There's no one answer to that. That's what the teacher has. But give the teacher the tools to teach the coping so that he or she can then navigate this classroom at this particular point in the school year when the work is getting harder and harder, and help kids to exercise their perseverance in the face of difficulty rather than give up.
And I know that as the moderator, coming up with your question, as the moderator, I'm not supposed to answer the question, but one of the important answers to that is there was a bit of a gender lens there. And I think as Pedro talked about in his work, that clearly the instruction needs to be student-centered, and along with that there's the equity lens, where there's clearly literature out there to demonstrate that there are some gender differences and that relationships are important for all students. Obviously, that's all we've been talking about. But for boys in particular, to create that internal motivation, relationships are even more important.
Just one, you come on up. I know one more sentence because it relates to the equity issue, which is where we started. Because some people will say that this social emotional stuff is building compliance, right? And we don't want kids who we want to educate to train and be rebellious at some level and change the system to become compliant within it. There's no compliance in empowering a child, right? You can teach children how to get along, and you can teach children how to be change agents. Both are skills kids can learn, and sometimes we need to exercise our capacity to get along, and sometimes we need to be change agents. And more often than not, maybe we want kids to be change agents. But you got to. So anyway, just to say that the political dimensions of this work. Sorry, stop.
All right, come on up with your question. I see this time.
Shut up. Yeah, okay.
Last question. Yep.
Last question.
I just had an interesting thought that wouldn't it be nice if your commission actually had a structure and some models for scope and sequence for social, emotional, academic progression?
Yes.
Because it goes back to your
Would be
point.
nice.
A lot of good ideas,
Yeah.
almost like ornaments on a tree, but there probably are several different frameworks of the tree of growth, of the integration of the social, emotional, and academic knowledge. And I was wondering, if you did have those frameworks, wouldn't it be cool also if you could show how class, culture, and community had impact in each stage of the scope and sequence?
Put Roger on that one.
Yeah, but the first one we got, the second one, the interaction on class culture and stuff.
But remember when I talked before about revise and resubmit?
Yeah.
How do you learn grit? Right? You tell a kid, you know what, you could do better.
Yeah.
But you don't just tell them you could do better, you give them the direct feedback. You know? So there are ways you can build it in, but I do think that's a good job.
And actually, Pedro is going to be working on Pedro's going to be working on doing exactly that. Your point to actually develop a framework is
good,
is
John.
Going back
critical.
to the Gallup poll, you know what one of the things the Gallup poll shows? What do you think is the most popular subject for kids up until middle school? Science.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
Why? Because science,
Curiosity.
natural curiosity. Kids want to know about the natural world.
Yeah.
You use that, what a way to teach. You can teach everything. So much you can teach through science. Right. And you already have the natural hook they want to learn.
Yeah.
All right, Jean, we're going to give you the last word here. And if you can specifically address the question on how the commission is really going to work to develop that comprehensive framework.
Well, there are models out there. There are some good things, and I think it is a role of the commission to pull those together and put them out there. For example, we say to teachers, you need to develop cooperation among your students. What is cooperation? What are the elements of cooperation? There are some tools that have broken that down into observable, teachable, measurable kinds of statements. And there are tools that have given descriptors out there about certain student behaviors that align with each of those behaviors. There are tools now that help students assess their own capacity in this area, to look at different behaviors and to set goals for themselves, metacognition, that these students need to develop. So they're out there, and I think it's just a matter of us pulling those together. Now, coming up with the second challenge is something that we had not contemplated, as Tim said, but something we'll take into.
That would provide sustainable support.
Yeah.
You're right.
I guess the other point of that is it does not, and the real trap some boards may get into is aligning this directly with the academic track of progress, and that would be wrong. There are some good lessons here.
And it's great to end on a suggestion to the commission. I really appreciate that.
that's a good one.
Absolutely. So we want to thank everyone today. We want to thank Rachel for joining the members of the commission here today. All right.